right, hey everyone. It is our first lecture. So like I mentioned already, I do try to keep my lecture videos a little bit on the shorter side so that you're not sitting here listening to like one big long hour or 75-minute long lecture. So these are all just going to be broken up throughout the semester. So we are getting started with an introduction to the human body this week. These slides are based on the textbook specifically. So this introduction chapter has some different learning objectives. So we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between anatomy and physiology, and kind of talk about some different branches of each of those. And obviously this course is focused on anatomy specifically. Physiology is a different course, but we will cover a little bit of physiology in here because these two things are so closely tied together, as you'll see in just a little bit. Our next objective is to determine the structure of the body from the simplest to the most complex. We have 6 levels of organization. We'll go into a little bit more detail about that. And then we want to identify some specific characteristics of human life, and we're going to talk a bit about homeostasis because it is really, really, really important to how humans function. Homeostasis is so incredibly important, so it's a really, really, really vital basic concept that we need to talk about. And then we'll kind of wrap up talking about different anatomical terminology for identifying different structures in the body, regions of the body, and how to give directions when we're talking about different parts of the body, because these are things that are really important and everybody in the scientific and medical community needs a common way to talk about the human body. We're also going to wrap up by talking a little bit about different types of medical imaging, but that will be the very last of this week's lecture series. So we are going to cover just sections 2 and 3 of chapter 1 in this specific video. So section 2 is an overview of anatomy and physiology. So we're going to compare and contrast these two a little bit and talk a bit more in detail about specializations and how each of these things are studied. And then we also want to talk about why it's important for us to talk about both of these things, even though this is a human anatomy class and physiology is taught as a separate class at this particular college. Not all colleges do that. A lot of them do combine anatomy and physiology into a single class, usually split over 2 semesters, but that's not the way Butte College does it. Alright, so just a quick introductory to anatomy and physiology. So anatomy is the study of the structures within the human body. So we're talking about basically the things that you would see with your eyes. And this falls into 2 different categories: gross anatomy and microscopic anatomy. So gross anatomy is the study of these larger structures of the body. These are things that are going to be visible without needing some sort of magnification, either a low power microscope or even a higher powered microscope for certain structures, depending on how small they are. Gross anatomy can sometimes, you can remember that by thinking, oh, it's gross, and if you see like a brain or heart or something, you might think, ew, gross. So that's what gross anatomy is referring to, and that is primarily what we will be focused on in lab material for this particular class. We will do a little bit of microscopic anatomy, especially when we get to the kidneys later in the semester, but most of what we're doing is going to be gross anatomy. Microscopic anatomy is pretty self-explanatory, I think. These are structures of various organs that can be observed only with a microscope or something else that allows us to have some magnification level. So like I mentioned, we will be doing a little bit of microscopic anatomy of the kidney later in the semester for the lab material, but most of our lab stuff will be focused on gross anatomy, which are those larger structures that we do not need a lot of magnification for. So this is just kind of a comparison of those two. So image A on the left, we are seeing the brain. So this would be an example of gross anatomy. So we do not need a microscope to see the brain. Whereas on the right, looking at cells of the nervous system, these neurons, we absolutely need a microscopic view of those in order to visualize them at all. So we have to have that magnification. In this case, these can be much smaller cells, so we do need a pretty good microscope in order to see those. So that's a good example of microscopic anatomy. Other things, other cells of the body would be microscopic, as well as little tiny structures within different organs, like microvilli and cilia and stuff like that would also be examples of microscopic anatomy. All right, so that's anatomy. So let's talk a tiny bit about physiology. So physiology is the study of basically the chemistry and physics that function within the body, and the ways that these work to support our life. So what keeps us alive. And so physiology is sometimes just thought of as the function, whereas anatomy is the structure. So we need both structure and function in order for our bodies to actually work together. So physiology focuses a lot on our tendency towards homeostasis. Homeostasis, in official terms, is the state of steady internal conditions that are maintained by all living things. Basically, we all have a baseline level of functioning that everything is working optimally at. So our optimum functioning, keeping different hormones within a certain range, keeping enzymes within a certain range, our temperature, all those kinds of things are part of homeostasis. So trying to maintain that steady, constant set of internal conditions and not have anything too far in one direction or the other. So like I mentioned just a minute ago, structure and function really are tied together. Again, anatomy is structure, physiology is function. So structure ultimately determines how things function and what their function is. So a good example of this is the structure of the small intestines. So we'll talk more about the small intestines later on in the semester, but just really quickly right now, the small intestines, they're going to be a tube. They've got a bunch of folds within them. So let me get my cursor over here. I don't know how well you can see that, but we have these circular folds within the small intestine. Those are going to help increase surface area. I'll talk more about that in a second. And then on each of those circular folds, we have villi, which are these little kind of hill-like projections. We have a bunch of those on each of the folds. And then on the surface of each of those villi, those little hills, we have microvilli, which are even tinier little hills that come up off of that. This is sometimes referred to as the brush border. Again, we'll go into more detail later in the semester about this. But all of these projections work together to increase surface area, and we want more surface area in the small intestines because that is where most of our nutrients are absorbed when we digest our food, and so we need as much space as we can possibly get to absorb as many nutrients as we possibly can. And because of the size of our bodies, we just don't have space for any more small intestines than we already have, and so that internal structure of the small intestines helps to increase that surface area so that we can absorb as many nutrients as possible. All right, so let's get into section 3 of the textbook. This is the structural organization of the human body. So we want to talk a little bit about the 6 levels of organization that our bodies follow. And then we're going to briefly look at the 11 different organ systems and kind of have an idea of which organs and functions those systems have. So the human body is organized again into 6 levels. We have chemical, cellular, tissue, organ system, and then the organism itself. So let's go into a little bit more detail about each of these. So the chemical level of organization, this is made up of subatomic particles like protons and electrons and neutrons. Those are obviously going to make atoms. Atoms combine together to form molecules, and those molecules are going to continue combining to form other structures. So a big important molecule for us is the water molecule. We are primarily composed of hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen as humans. We're made up of plenty of other different elements and atoms, but those are kind of the big ones for most living things. The next level of organization is the cellular level. So this is where molecules combine together in certain ways to form the fluid and tiny little organelles or mini organs of a single cell. And a cell is the smallest living unit, smallest functional unit of any living organism. Some organisms are single cell, like bacteria. We're not talking about bacteria a lot in here. But our cells are a bit more complex than that, but these are going to help make the next level of organization. So we have lots of different types of cells. We have different types of muscle cells, we have nervous system cells, we have blood cells, we have skin cells, so on and so forth. So we'll look into each of those cell types in a little bit more detail when we get to those individual organ systems. Next level is tissue. So tissues are made up of similar cells that all join together to perform a similar function. All right, so multiple smooth muscle cells are going to combine together to form smooth muscle tissue, which is then used for different organs like the bladder, the digestive system organs, as well as our blood vessels. Next, we have organs. These are very distinct structures anatomically that are in the body, composed of two or more types of tissues. A lot of our organs are going to be made up of multiple tissue types in order for them to function and do their job the way they're supposed to. And so, for example, the bladder is made up of two different types of muscle cells or muscle tissues, as well as some different types of epithelial tissue. Sorry, I blanked on the tissue type I was thinking about. So epithelial tissues are going to be what lines the inside and outside of the bladder as well. Then we have organ systems. These are groups of different organs that work together to perform bigger functions or meet certain needs of the body. So for example, here we have the urinary tract system, or just urinary system, and this is made up of the kidneys, ureters, bladder, and urethra. So those are all different organs that all work together to help us eliminate waste from our body, as well as helping to keep water in our body and retain that water as needed so that we're not getting dehydrated. We're going to go into a little bit more detail about different organ systems here in just a moment, but before we do that, our last level of organization is the organism itself. In our particular case, our organism is a human, and so this is where many different organ systems and different types of tissues work together to perform the functions of a single organism or an independent organism. So without most of our organ systems in our body, we would not be able to survive and function as well as we need to if we were able to survive at all. We can have slight issues with different organs and still be okay depending on what that organ is, but we're not going to be functioning at our optimal level. All right, so let's go into a tiny bit more detail about the different organ systems in our body. Again, there are 11 different organ systems. We will go into more detail about each of these organ systems throughout the semester. We'll do kind of a deep dive into them, but just as a quick overview right now, first we have the integumentary system. This is going to enclose a lot of our internal body structures, so our organs and blood vessels and stuff like that. that. We also have a lot of sensory receptors on our integumentary system, and it is made up of the skin, hair, and nails, among some other different types of cells and glands. We'll talk more about that later when we cover this particular system. The first thing we'll be talking about is the skeletal system. So this is offering body support and helps with movement in conjunction with the muscular system, because without the muscles, the skeleton is not going to move. But the skeletal system is made of cartilage, bones, and joints. So we'll go into more detail about that in, I think, week 3 and 4. That will come up pretty quickly. That'll be our first main system we talk about. And then we've got the muscular system. Obviously, like I said, this is going to help with movement, but without our bones, we don't always move very well, so muscles attach to bones, which enables us to move. Muscles are also going to help us maintain our body temperature, so shivering is our muscles repeatedly contracting to help produce heat so that we warm back up. So that's one way they help us maintain body temperature. These are also going to cause our heart to beat, as well as helping with our digestive system. So those are different types of muscles, though, so those types of muscles are usually discussed specifically in conjunction with those organ systems. So usually when the muscular system is referred to, it's talking about skeletal muscles particularly, as well as tendons. So we'll go into more detail about that later in the semester. Sorry, went too far. Skip the nervous system. Nervous system is the brain, spinal cord, and all of the nerves in our body. These are going to detect and process any information from the senses, from our environment, so things we see, hear, feel, smell, etc., as well as help us respond to different environmental inputs. So, for example, if you were to put your hand on a hot stove, you're obviously going to jerk your hand back really, really quickly because your nervous system is detecting that sensory information of, ow, that's really hot, that's too hot, and it is going to cause your skeletal muscles to contract and pull your hand away from your body or from the hot stove so that you are not getting further injury from having it on that hot surface. Next is the endocrine system. This is honestly one of my favorite systems of the human body. It's really, really interesting. So we're going to secrete hormones here with the endocrine system, and hormones ultimately regulate so many of our body processes. It is phenomenal how much of our function relies on the endocrine system. So the pituitary gland, thyroid gland, pancreas, adrenal glands, testes, and ovaries, depending on genetic makeup, are all going to be part of the endocrine system. There are more parts of the endocrine system, but these are the big ones. Next, we have the cardiovascular system. This is the heart and blood vessels. This is where we're delivering oxygen and nutrients to tissues and picking up carbon dioxide and waste products to get rid of those. Our cardiovascular system is also going to help equalize temperatures in the body, so our blood vessels can expand or contract in order to conserve heat or release more heat, among other things. Next is the lymphatic system. Our immune system also falls under the lymphatic system, so we'll talk about the lymphatic and immune systems together in the same week. Lymphatic system is going to return excess fluids into the bloodstream, and then the immune system is going to help us defend against pathogens. So the thymus, which we as adults no longer have, actually, we'll talk more about that later, and then our lymph nodes, spleen, and all of the lymphatic vessels, as well as different types of immune cells, are going to be making up this system. Then we've got our respiratory system. I think most people are probably pretty aware of what our respiratory system does. It's made up of our nasal passageway, trachea, and lungs. We'll go into more detail about that later, but this is getting carbon dioxide out of the body and picking up oxygen to deliver it back into the bloodstream. Digestive system, again, I think this is a pretty obvious one for most people. This is where we're processing food so that the body can use it for nutrients and energy. It is also going to help remove certain waste products from our undigested food. So the mouth, esophagus, stomach, liver, gallbladder, large and small intestines, among other parts, all make up that digestive system. We also have the urinary system. This is also going to help remove some waste products, primarily from the bloodstream, and get rid of them. And like I said earlier, this also controls our water balance. So the urinary system is in charge of releasing or saving water as needed, depending on our hydration levels. And again, this is kidneys, ureters, bladder, and urethra. Then we have the reproductive system. Depending on whether somebody has two X chromosomes or an X and a Y chromosome, their reproductive system organs are going to be a little bit different, although interestingly, all of the reproductive organs originate from the exact same tissue during embryonic development. We'll go into more detail about that later. But people who have X and Y chromosomes are typically referred to as males. This is a biological determination, not a gender thing. We'll go into more detail about that later. People who have two X chromosomes are usually referred to as female. So for both systems, regardless of chromosome makeup, the organs are going to produce the sex hormones as well as gametes, which are sperm and egg cells. Those are for reproduction. And then depending on the exact organs, so somebody who has an XY chromosome makeup, those structures are going to help deliver the gametes, in this case sperm cells, into the other reproductive system of the females or people with XX chromosomes. So a little bit different function than the other organ system with two X chromosomes. Obviously that is going to still create those gametes and sex hormones, but also is enabled to help support that growing embryo and fetus and actually birth that fetus and then produce milk for the infant as well. But again, the exact organs are a little bit different. For XY makeup, we have the epididymis and testes are the main two organs in that system. There are some extra ones we'll go into more detail about later. And then for that XX reproductive system, our mammary glands, ovaries, and uterus are the main structures performing these different actions. All right, so that wraps up the first of our Chapter 1 lecture videos.